Mark, Mark, the movie man Krawcheck. We are here to
Hello.
talk about. Oh, hello. I do this. I like start the introductions and I ramble and ramble, and finally, after minutes on end, I give my guest the chance to speak. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I tried to uh, reduce the camera here a bit, but you can see my whole studio. So apologize if it's a little messy back there. I didn't get a
Ah,
chance to clean it all. So, but that's how messy my brain is. It's like very chaotic. So
it's also apropos of the Sawyer house from the
it
Texas
is.
Chainsaw Massacre. Yeah.
I'm not that bad now. Come on. I don't have any human lampshades currently hanging from the lamps currently. But
What are those DVD shelves made out of human bones that have been lacquered to a fine black?
all I will say is this is Wisconsin, home of Ed Gein, and we'll leave it at that. And you can use your imagination on what those shells might or might not be made of.
I'm
So
just gonna say particle board so that nobody
there you
watches
go.
this and comes after you. Like,
Particle board in quotes. Particle
yeah,
board.
he
We didn't say what
particulates.
particles, particulates. We didn't say what particles. It's amazing what you could do with compressed you know, take little refined grindings and compress them. It's amazing what you can do. So
Officer, Mark didn't deny making for shelving out of all those disappeared hitchhikers in Stevens Point. No, all right. Well, we're going to do something a little bit different today. As you might have guessed, we're talking not exactly about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We're going to be talking about a documentary called The Legacy of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, back when it was 2 words instead of one with all the sequels and stuff. Why are we talking about it? Well, it's because recently Dark Sky Films released a 4K Blu-ray edition of the movie. Look, I've got this one, has the slipcase. And then Mark's got the steelbook version. It's
yep.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the 4K steelbook version. Comes with a little sticky on the back of it. But yeah,
Is it
pretty
stuck together with blood?
pretty slick. It comes with a
Yeah.
poster inside it.
Really?
And yeah, it comes with the actually it's partly what you have and partly what I have. It's a mini poster of the original, and then it also has what you have on
Oh
your
my! I,
slipcover
I
as
sent you
well.
the wrong edition, Mark. I've just this thing
and
just
then
comes with the discs. Yeah.
and then the inside also has an image as well. The only disappointing thing for me is the fact that well, not disappointing. I've been meaning to invest in one anyway, a 4K device, so I can play this on my PC monitor, but with a 4K device. But I don't have a 4K device yet. And the movie in this steelbook is only on the 4K. It does not have a Blu-ray version of the film, but I've got two other Blu-ray versions of the film. Plus, I've got the DVD steelbook that was originally released way back when.
Do you have
Um,
the one that was the hamburger meat one, the DVD from years ago?
no, I don't have the hamburger meat one, and I don't have the truck one because I could never afford it because it's just the box, the case, but it only is like two DVDs or a Blu-ray and DVD, but it's like the big truck, but I got nowhere to put it. But almost got that, but
Yeah, it's a cool idea, but I don't know if it's a cardboard truck or
it
what. But yeah,
it looks
anyway,
cardboard. It looks cardboard. And
yeah.
I didn't put up, I'm sorry, I didn't put up my Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 vinyl in the back either. I failed. Here's my credit card again. The second
It's
one.
it's okay because we're
Okay.
talking about the first movie. So the fact
Yeah,
that you
I
don't have
know.
Texas
But
Chainsaw 2 out, that's fine.
yeah, well,
But no, I mean, well, the documentary we're going to be talking about, fortunately, was on the Blu-ray
yes.
version of disc
Hmm.
2, along with some other supplemental features. But everyone's talked Texas Chainsaw to death, and that's not to say that we won't talk about it in the future, because next year is the 50th anniversary of the movie. That's crazy. 1974 to 2024. Wow. Really, really ages you when you start to think about movies the way that you grew up with.
Yeah, it's only a year older than I am.
Wow.
So
Well, hopefully you weren't watching it in the crib,
no.
but although it would explain a lot. No,
Mhm.
so I wanted to talk about this documentary because, as I mentioned, a lot has been said about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but there's a new feature-length doc on this disc called The Legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I was really excited about this. I don't know how you feel about it now that you've watched it, but I was utterly disappointed, borderline devastated by the time I finished watching this documentary. It's essentially an hour, just under an hour and a half EPK, I feel like, that all of the material for a great Texas Chainsaw Legacy doc was right there on the screen. It's just like the filmmakers decided, we'll talk about other things.
Well, here's the thing, and it's funny because there's some familiar faces on there. I didn't even know she was in there, but Jill Six is in there, director of the stylist. She showed up. I was like, oh, hey, I sent her a screenshot and said, hey, look who showed up. She's like, oh, I haven't seen it yet. So, you know, and they've got some other familiar faces for sure talking about it and the influences. And, you know, for me, as far as documentaries go, it was interesting to hear their perspective. And I guess the one thing I found interesting was the fact that they were saying things that I and my friends, when we've talked about Texas Chainsaw for many years, have been saying the exact same things. So they see independent, you know, the individuals independent of one another talking about and basically all having the same theories and concepts and approaches in that. I find, at least, which was interesting, was I'm like, holy crap, I've been saying that exact thing, you know, the things they were saying about it, about, you know, the documentary style and how it was shot and how it's actually, you know, it's more appreciated now than when it came out because of what actually is going on in this film. And I found that interesting, but I didn't think this needed to be a feature length documentary, only because while it affirmed opinions that many fans probably have on their own, like I, you know, and talked with their circle of friends, while it may have gave a validation for that, at the same time it was a bit repetitive and it wasn't really adding anything new as far as what has come in the past of supplemental. And there's some tidbits of new that interesting. I liked how they explored influences and they touch on later on in the documentary Tobe Hooper himself and kind of, you know, his career in that part I thought, but that's like the last 10 minutes of this. The rest of it is really just presenting stuff again. And I haven't watched the other supplemental material, but is pretty much presenting stuff that has been presented many times before. So if this is the first time you're picking this up and you haven't ever watched anything, you know, even though you're a fan, you just happen to not watch anything else on it, this documentary you may find a bit more fascinating. For me, it was great seeing the other people's opinions and seeing we all share very similar views. On the other hand, I was like, what is the purpose of this?
Yeah, I think you're right. If you're just getting into horror, or if you've just discovered the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a great primer on the film. And I guess the kind of the legacy of it. But my problem is exactly what you kind of led in with. These are the conversations that I feel like everybody who's into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre has been having for decades about the movie. I didn't see a whole lot of new insight here. And in fact, I saw some of the talking points were things that have always kind of bugged me about it. You know, there's a lot of dissing the South and dissing Texas and all of this stuff. And like, you know, us Northerners are terrified to go into the South and you never know what's going to happen down there. I'm like, yeah, that's the kind of regional prejudice that is very easy. And the same kind of thing, you know, I'm sure people in the South could be like, I would never go to New York, you know, just a bunch of, you know, crazy, you know, flaming liberals out there or something like that. It'd be nice to have some kind of a balance or maybe a perspective of someone who is, you know, from Texas, like really talking about maybe even what that stigma that was, you know, kind of raised by the movie has brought about. I think it was mentioned once, but not really, no one dug into it.
Yeah, I mean they touch on it, and again, nothing like. First, I'd like to say all the people in here very great, knowledgeable. Nothing against them whatsoever. It's more of those who created the documentary it was just, yeah, there's stuff to touch on the South. You don't have anybody. You do have directors from the past films, and I know many of them have, some of them have passed on or whatnot, but you don't have any surviving members at all from the cast or crew involved show up in this documentary, which you're talking about the legacy of the documentary. You'd at least maybe have, if even, and again, it's 50 years, they're probably in their 70s, but there's still a few of the folks around, I believe, of to get them, and that might even be more of a perspective. You've got everybody else who you could still include, but give us someone who was actually involved in the film and maybe give a bit more insight into behind the scenes stuff that we either might not know, or it would add a little bit more to this, rather than just being a bunch of fans gushing about it. And again, nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong. It's just, we've covered this territory with Texas Chainsaw in over 50 years. Can you come up with anything more? And I guess that was my question, is, okay, this was all interesting to hear these views. What was your reasoning for making this? Because nothing felt really new. And the other supplemental material that is on here, dear Lord, you're probably going to get some repeat. I haven't watched all the extras because there's just a laundry list of amazing extras on here, but I almost guarantee you're probably going to get a repeat of some of that info. So it's just one of those things where, yeah, where what is this adding? I guess it doesn't necessarily have to, but it just, if this is the special, full new feature, what are you bringing new to this then?
Right. And, I understand there's possibly limitations, and we weren't obviously involved in the making of this or anything, but you bring up an interesting point. Like Terry McMinn, who played Pam in the film, there was a line or two, again, it feels like during the back half of this thing, where they're talking about how, it was such a shocking cultural phenomenon, this film, when it came out, that, she had trouble getting work afterwards, along with some of the other principal cast, and she distanced herself from the movie until about the time of the 40th anniversary, when she started doing convention appearances. I think it was around that time that I met her and some of the other people. I've got a nice signed poster somewhere, and she was very nice, and her and Edwin Neal were at a convention together, and they were just like cracking each other up and cracking me up. But it would be nice to have them involved to talk. I don't believe Marilyn Burns is with us anymore.
No, she is not. She passed away 3 years ago,
something like that.
Yeah.
But they make constant reference to the I guess troubling shooting conditions of, it's an independent kind of low budget, bunch of Texan filmmakers, young kids, like making their first like big movie, and so they were going for something real and visceral, and didn't have the same kind of like safety protocols that they did today. But I don't think that the one bit of new information, I don't think I'd ever heard that the thumb cutting scene at the end, they actually cut her thumb because the squib wasn't working. That was pretty intense. But the whole point is, it'd be nice to have gotten them to talk about their experiences, rather than a bunch of people after the fact saying, yeah, I heard it was really terrible. And they had some onset stills and a little bit of, kind of video to play to go along with it. But there's that first person account that was, I think, sorely missing. But
right.
Oh, go ahead.
No, and that's, I think, the one thing that would have probably added it for me, is if they would have had, and they wouldn't necessarily even have to be in there too long, but just blips here and there. And I understand they may not have, they may have reached out, we weren't involved in it, and they possibly couldn't get these folks, or the folks didn't want to talk about it. But maybe mention that in your documentary. I mean, we're talking 50 years now. It's one of those things where we have other classic films that are still classics, but are no longer, people have the gloves off, and they've dove into what had went on in the back and the behind the scenes stuff, kind of the stuff that was kind of hush hush for a while. And I'm not saying dig up a bunch of dirty laundry or anything, but I'm just saying that, okay, you mentioned something in here, like you mentioned, you mentioned something in here about the conditions in that, but that's it. You don't even have like a footage or a clip that you could have gotten from a previous interview involving one of the original cast, maybe mentioning that. I mean, and I'm all for documentaries where it's just presenting the interviews. You don't have Mr. Voiceover giving you the opinion to, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just presenting the information and letting you kind of draw how things are. But yeah, there is no there's no real first-hand account. I mean, the closest one they have is the friend of Tobe Hooper's, who was in there. I forgot the gentleman's
Mick
name.
Garris, yeah.
Mick Garris. Having him on there was probably the closest you had to something like that, because he gave a bit of an insight, But yeah, outside of that, while is interesting, it didn't add anything for me. I'm like sitting here going, okay, I was waiting for that shoe to drop that you get in documentaries where we give all these kind of pleasant, positive things you'd lead, and then you're like, and then there was a death on set. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Something like that, or something. That firsthand account, I think, is the biggest thing missing for a documentary about the legacy of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were, I was probably being a bit too harsh. There were some insights that I hadn't really considered before about how, previous to this film, most horror movies had focused on adults. This was,
Right.
although it's weird because they refer to these, oh, it's the first one to focus on teenagers. I'm like, I never really saw like Sally and Pam and Kirk and all them as teenagers. They're like, maybe they're early 20s college kids, but then again, people were they looked a lot older back in the back in the day. And that's a well-worn trope. But my biggest disappointment with this, and what I had expected when I started seeing these various names pop up on screen, you've got Marcus Nispel, who directed my gosh, it's 20 years old now, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake with Jessica Biel. You had people who were involved in the 2022 Netflix adaptation, which we talked about and disagreed on. I actually kind of liked it, and I'm in the very small minority here, which I'm totally fine with. Nothing new there. But you had people who were involved in like the various other incarnations that have come out in the last couple decades. You get them on screen talking about Texas Chainsaw in like, when was the first time I saw it? And it was so terrifying. It was unlike anything else I'd ever seen. I'm like, let's talk about the legacy. That's what we're here for. How did you feel when you were approached or tapped to do a remake or a sequel? Did you talk to Tobe Hooper? Did you ever think, there's no way I think it was, it might have been Fede Alvarez, who we had talked recently about on your show, for the Evil Dead remake. He had talked about how, it's impossible to capture the rawness of the dinner scene that closes out that film. I would have loved to have dug in to have him dig into, well, in light of that fact, how can you bring something new to a sequel or a remake? How do you feel about that in the projects you're working on? Maybe even not related to Texas Chainsaw, like the Evil Dead remake. It would have been, maybe it's because those pictures didn't do very well. I mean, some of them did better than others. I know the Texas Chainsaw 2003, from my recollection, was a pretty big hit because that was one of the forebearers of the giant, let's remake everything from the 70s and 80s, partially because of the success of that movie, right? But then it was diminishing returns after every subsequent sequel, and now we're firmly into multiple remake territory. But yeah, I just thought it was a big missed opportunity. I'm like, beyond like maybe a 2-minute anecdote, I don't care what you thought the first time you saw it, because again, most people had the same kind of reaction. It's nothing new.
And that's the thing, is they could have, with it being legacy, I'm no one from anyone, but I guess the way I would have approached it if I would have made the documentary was, like you said, start off with their first time seeing Texas Chainsaw and then going, well, how did it influence? You've got these filmmakers. How did this influence your filmmaking going forward? You, or the gentleman, the folks who were involved in doing the remakes or sequels, well, what did you take from the original and what did you feel possibly needed to be updated. I mean, you could have dug that. It still kept focus on the legacy of Texas Chainsaw, but showing more of how it impacted these folks going forward, whereas most of it was talking about the original movie still. And I understand maybe that's the point, but we've gotten so many other documentaries and stuff about that's covered that. I would have been interested to see, well, okay, especially the Leatherface 2022 guys that they had it, you know, the directors for that. I'd be like, okay, you know, they barely touch on it, but I'm like, I would say, okay, find out, how did this impact you and how did it influence your filmmaking going forward? What did you want to bring to the new one, but still keep with the original? You know, I mean, there's very opportunities where you could have done that, and instead we got a lot of surface level type of things with the majority of it. Not all of it, don't get me wrong, like you said, there are some tidbits here there, but for the most part it's like, okay, are we going to get to how this impacted them as creatives? And we don't really get those moments.
Right. And there was another thing that I don't think I'd really thought about before that was kind of a light bulb moment. There was a whole stretch where they were talking about the lack of score in the original Texas Chainsaw. And at first I thought it was kind of bullshit, because I'm like, no, there's a score. Like when the opening bit with those like weird sun flares and stuff like that, like that's not really music. It's sort of this all of this weird sound, like the cymbals, you know, echoing and reverberating. That, you know, Hooper, he's credited with the score on the film, but it's not like a musical score. There's not, you know, crazy tension. A lot of it is just, it's all in the editing and the screaming in the most intense moments, right? So that was a great insight. But they also, a lot of these filmmakers talk about how, and this is familiar territory too, the lack of actual gore. Like a lot of Texas Chainsaw, the thing that freaks people out is the idea of being stranded in this place with these crazy people, and oh my god, they're making furniture out of bones and hanging people on hooks. It's not that graphic. So my question would be, and maybe it's because it's a touchy subject or egos are involved or what have you, but I want to ask someone like Marcus Nispel or the people who directed the 2022 version, why did you go with, you know, scores? Why did you decide to go in the arena of like over the top gore and ultra violence on screen, when you admit that one of the things that really captivated you is how you don't see a lot? It's kind of like the same thing with Halloween. You know, you can't really say this about Friday the 13th, because that was a gore and special effects showcase for Tom Savini. But Halloween is another one that, you know, there's not a whole lot of blood on screen in that movie. But as the subsequent movies, especially the ones in the last decade, have come out, there's like, I mean, from the Rob Zombie version to, you know, whatever the hell David Gordon Green's been doing, it's just it's, you know, gallons of blood everywhere.
Yeah, and I would have thought that they would kind of want to go that route with it, especially with the title of the, you know, it's the legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And again, they touch on it, but you're an hour and 22-minute documentary, and you might have maybe 5 to 10 minutes of that insight altogether from all of these talented individuals you've collected, who are, you can tell, are fans and very talented filmmakers in their own right, or, you know, reviewers or whatnot. And it almost felt like they were afraid to dive into, you know, such things or touch on such things, regardless of how the film did. I've seen people, you know, filmmakers talk about films, even if they aren't, you know, they weren't that well received or whatnot, they'll talk about them, you know, what they did with them. And the lack of gore discussion I've always had. I that's something that I run into constantly when people ask, well, what's your favorite horror film? And I go, well, it's a tie. It's Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho. And not just because they're both tied to Ed Gein. Okay. It just, that's a coincidence. All right. It is truly a coincidence.
I got to know about those books, those DVD shelves behind you, Mark. You're playing your hand.
but it's one of those things where they mentioned that, they start off with that, and it's true. That's always been my point, and that was mostly due to budget. budget constraints was the fact you didn't have a whole lot of gore because that cost money and you could only do so much, especially if you're shooting with film. So with their creative editing and that, the film is not nearly as gory as what you actually only see the first burst of actual gore when uh what's his name in the wheelchair gets
Oh, Franklin, yeah.
Franklin, thank you. Franklin gets aced is the first time you really see on screen spurting blood. And even then, it's in the dark and under through a flashlight. So it's a little hard to tell. But, and that's the third act of the film. But the rest of it is all in your imagination, which is one of the special things about it. And so to hear them talk about that, I really enjoyed and glad I haven't been off all these years telling people the same thing, basically almost as exact word for word things. So for that part, I like that part of it. But it was just interesting with this of why should I invest my hour and 20 minutes?
Yeah. I mean, and they also take some weird detours. It's kind of been a joke, I guess, that there have been people who've watched the movie and turned vegetarian,
Yeah.
But they go on this weird jag about how Texas Chainsaw is actually a pro-vegetarian movie, and they say like Guillermo del Toro claims that after he watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he didn't eat meat for a year and a half. I don't know that I believe it, and if that's true, it's kind of pathetic. Like it's just it's a big dumb horror. I mean, it's a smart horror movie, but it's nothing to change your life over necessarily.
It was interesting they took the conversation there. I was like, that's the first time I've actually, I think, heard that part of it. And I'm like, we're going here now? Okay. I mean, I'm like, turned you vegan? Oh, all right. Sure, but I like that angle, and there it was starting to take a kind of a direction and a purpose, but that only lasted so long before we just get back to the superlatives.
Well, and then also they go on this. I took it personally because I'm a film critic partially, but also because once again, I'm kind of annoyed because there is no balance. They talk about film critics in general, and this is, one of the longer conversational threads towards the end of the piece, where they talk about how critics spurned the movie back in '74 when it came out. And there is this whole notion of like, well, critics always get it wrong, and they're part of the establishment and the entertainment industry, and independent film is all about like the rebels and the renegades. So of course critics aren't going to get it. I'm like, there are people that recognize controversial, cutting edge things and will shout it from the rooftops. But famously, I think it was Heather Wixson, who's good friends with Patrick Bromley, who's the world's, I think, foremost Tobe Hooper fan, who did a great commentary on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 4K that came out a couple months ago, I think from Vinegar Syndrome, if I have that right. But she was talking about how she grew up like loving Roger Ebert, but he had a blind spot when it came to horror, and that's true. But there wasn't a deeper discussion about that. Maybe it's tough to dig up critics from that era who would have maybe panned the movie and possibly changed their minds on it, but it was very kind of one directional. There was no discussion about film critics changing their minds, or maybe some of them have been right about horror movies or will cop to being wrong. I know for a fact Ebert, I saw him at a book signing years ago, and someone had asked him about A Clockwork Orange. Then he admitted that was one of his great, not regrets, but one of the things that he got the most wrong. Like when it first came out, he was outraged and found it morally reprehensible and vowed never to watch again or something like that. And then he came back to revisit it, some years later, I think after it had caught on and sort of like the critical esteem of it had grown, and he came to appreciate it. So that's not to say that he revisited Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't know if he ever did, but it was this kind of like easy, the film critics always get it wrong when it comes to genre. I'm like, that's not true. And it's just a bunch of talking heads, even though some of them are critics or profess to be critics. I'm like, I feel like they should know better than to just like shit on critics.
Well, and that was the thing is, if I'm remembering correctly, that section in the documentary, we don't actually get a counterpoint from the critics that they have as part of the interview. That came from a couple of the filmmakers about how hard critics were, but we didn't actually get a counterpoint when you literally have two or three movie critics who are, cover a lot of horror, and you have them on here because they're horror fans, specifically Texas Chainsaw Massacre fans. And I don't think we get a point from them or a perspective on them on that idea that the critics get it wrong on horror, because they didn't quite frame it either as saying the critics back then. They just said the critics are part, the critics come out and they're part of the establishment. I'm like, do you mean back then or now? Because you literally have critics on your documentary who are fans of this film, have always been fans of this film, and you don't get their counterpoint or a defense of critics. Like you said, they put that nugget out there and then they move on.
Yeah. And I might be asking way too much of this thing, because that's the frustration is when it's advertised as a feature-length documentary. The reason I call it an hour and 20-minute EPK is, they do touch on some things that are, kind of unique ideas or germane to the film and the film conversation, but there's nothing controversial here. There's no digging deeper. It's controversial if you happen to be on the opposite side of some of these issues and are wondering, where's my perspective? It's almost like, hey, everybody agrees on these facts, right? And like, no, not really.
Well, I mean, and if you're going to have someone present that out there about the, then have your critics come back with, well, things have changed over the years with critics, but more new critics who are introduced to the film for the first time have actually enjoyed it, many of them, and just give a little bit of that with it, or even the vegan angle, whether or not that was intended, the intention, that's how many people took it and went vegan, what about those who didn't, but it's more the critic angle that was kind of awkward. It was like, well, the critics usually get it wrong at establishment in horror films. I'm like, do you mean when exactly? And are you referring to just Texas Chainsaw? And that's where they were digging into the broader horror genre for critics. And you're like, yeah, even the press, even the ones who are well known, to say they're part of the Hollywood establishment like that and not have a counterpoint or something to someone say, well, it's been like that, but things have changed over the years or whatnot, and yeah, I mean, they try to touch on it a little bit too, on if Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out today, how would it be received? But that was more about the gore and the violence of it, not so much of how would it be received. I don't think they really touch on, well, what if it came out today? They mentioned the question, but it was more in the regards of the gore, not the film itself, I think.
Well, that's also, and again, that might be the subject of an entire different conversation, but it's like, you can't pose that question, because part of what made the Texas Chainsaw Massacre so special is that it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have almost 50 years later is countless imitators and people who've done things with the genre and gone in different directions. But it's like, if it came out today, like this movie, it might get lumped in with everything else, but it's almost like that time travel paradox. Like,
Yeah,
it's the thing that started everything. So what if it came out today? Well, it depends on if something else like it had come out at the time to influence everything to make it like just another thing on the heap, or would it be, would it set the world on fire because it's so audacious? It definitely kicked open a bunch of doors for the genre. And I think that's something else that they could have talked about. Like, if this was, Psycho is kind of the proto slasher movie in a lot of people's minds, and then you've got Texas Chainsaw 14 years later, and then soon after you've got Halloween, Friday the 13th, countless imitators. What's the legacy of that? How do we get from the 80s, which like all these slasher genre pictures, to the 90s where everything kind of went dead and direct to video, to the early 2000s where there's a renaissance led by Marcus Nispel's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which, if you think about it, is kind of like a shot to the arm of the genre, because like it again blew doors wide open and made all these other films possible. It led to a lot of crappy sequels and remakes, and not
Yeah.
just for Texas Chainsaw, but for other properties. But now we're living through another kind of renaissance of horror that isn't even tied to intellectual properties.
Right.
Hit horror movies like Megan, like Smile, coming out, and people, the whole Blumhouse thing. Like, you could make a 3-hour documentary entitled "The Legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre" that doesn't talk about the movie really at all, like the behind the scenes stuff, but just like how that has literally affected horror in, the last 50 years, the last half century. Can you believe it?
Yeah, and I was hoping for a bit of a wider scope, and maybe it was a rights thing, maybe it was how they put this together with people that they knew and what they had rights to, maybe is why they, approached it the way it did. But that would be that talk about the legacy, yeah. Talk about how it influenced other films. Get some interviews from cons. Yeah, I mean, you're gonna find some fans there to talk about why, find some younger fans at a con who might be a Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan waiting in line to meet one of the few cast members left. Interview them, find out why they enjoy Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is almost 50 years old, especially if you get a 20-something horror fan with wearing a Texas Chainsaw Massacre t-shirt, which there's plenty of them out there. I've seen them at conventions. It's like, why? There's a legacy question. What does it appeal to you? Why do you enjoy it? Considering a lot of 20-somethings won't watch films past a certain amount.
Well, and you just gave me another great idea. I'm just gonna fucking go make a documentary called "The Real Legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre." You've inspired me. No, that's way too much work.
Yeah.
But no, but here's the question, because I think we might have talked about this during our Chainsaw 22 conversation, or maybe we've talked about it before in general. There are people out there who really respond to the remakes, and they say, "This is my Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't want to watch the old one because it's, half a century old, and there's no gore in it, and there's no nudity or whatever. It's dated. It's a bunch of like weird looking hippie people getting chopped up. The new Leatherface, that's my bag." Talk to them and find out, do you understand that the movie that you love now would not have been possible without this other thing that you refuse to watch? Or find out if they maybe said that at the time and then they went back and watched it and they have an appreciation for it. Or here's an audacious idea: find some people who are horror fans who hate Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You might have to dig real deep, but is there a counterpoint to the love fest?
Right. It's that those are things that I don't think have been explored as much with the property. And they do get into the discussions of the final girl, and the scene and the family dynamic of what they had with the Sawyers. A lot of firsts with it, which is really great. But again, it is familiar territory. That's been discussed in other documentaries. But yeah, they could have gone many directions with this, and it just surprises me the direction they decided to go with it. And maybe it was a budgetary thing, but then ask yourself, does it need to be a feature length film? I mean, because I got I've been reviewing. Actually, I'm behind on 2-disc reviews. I got the Rocky Collection I got a review yet that was just released, and the Training Day one. But the Bones and All one, brand new film, came out, right? Its extras were anemic, to say the least. There was a I think it was 3 minutes or so on the concept of Bones and All, and then they had 2 little character featurettes about it. But I think altogether the supplemental material was maybe 15 minutes long, and it looks like it was all shot during the same press thing, and they just cut it up, for different. And so I'm saying they could have easily done that with this, had, grouped the critics together or whatnot, and just done these short featurettes rather than as a full feature film with it, because of the repetition you end up getting in this documentary.
Yeah, Well, first of all, I mean, like it's nice that Dark Sky and other kind of distributors like Vinegar Syndrome, that they put out these deluxe editions with all of this supplemental material. Some of it's, reused from other
Mhm.
incarnations, some of it's new stuff, but you're really going to find that with things that the fans of the films are going to show up and spend the 40, 50, sometimes,
Right.
$70 to get the latest, greatest, like the 4K transfer of this movie, whereas they've already bought, as you mentioned, like the Blu-ray or the DVD or I remember that was one nice thing during one of the opening montages. They showed the media VHS, and like that was my first Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I
Nice.
got the warm fuzzies. But that's the thing, is like with newer things like Bones and All, unless it's a big critical darling, they're not going to invest. I mean, it's a miracle that they got any kind of supplements
Yeah.
on that disc, even a press junket that they cut up into 3 parts or whatever. There's just not that call or the budget for it,
Which
because
is
that
really
costs money.
which is really hilarious given how easy tech is now, where you literally have a camera phone in your hand. You could hire someone for base pay to just go around and say, hey, you're going to be our BTS guy. Here's a iPhone with a 4K camera on it. Go around and, shoot some stuff, and then so we can put it together. You could even do that if you wanted, but they don't even do that
Well,
anymore,
that's the
and
sticky proposition, because a lot of times you're talking about spending money on extras of a film that may have lost money theatrically, and they're hoping to
that's
recoup
true.
it in home video.
That's true. But
But that's all speculation. I mean, that's the thing, is like, I appreciate that they put effort into doing a behind the scenes, or like a legacy documentary. I
Mhm.
guess it just boils down to, it's not what I expected. Um, it's almost kind of like the Texas Chainsaw remakes and sequels that they've done, with a couple of notable exceptions. It's like I go to it hopeful that there's a reason to invest my time, and I walk out being like, in this case, it's like, well, I could just go back and listen to the, Tobe Hooper commentary and get way more
Right.
insight about what this movie means to the people involved with it.
Right. And that's the thing is I'm not I don't want people out there to think I don't think it's a bad documentary as far as how it's put together. And again, everybody giving their opinion in that. You can tell they picked fans and everything. It was, I enjoyed watching it, but I'm like you, I'm like, it wasn't what I was going to expect from supposedly a brand new documentary. That's how they're touting it, brand new new feature-length documentary, The Legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is how they deem it on the box. And while it is new as far as a newly made one, as far as what's in that documentary wasn't quite new. And at this point, like you said, with the 50th anniversary coming up, um, those of us who are huge fans will probably quadruple or whatever it is now, sextet dip um into the pool. But at the same time, give a, you know there's still some stuff that I would love to see. And I'm not saying, a documentary or something that shits all over the film, but maybe give us a counterpoint point type of documentary. Now that it's almost 50 years, take the gloves off a bit and dive into people enjoying it, because if nothing else, that's a topical conversation right now. Do you enjoy this artistic work given what has come out about the filmmaker behind it, the creator, whatnot? I mean, especially for some of these older movies, that's something that you should feel comfortable rolling out now. Not saying to slam the film, but just present maybe some things that have been for so many years, because fans now are going to be interested in it. They're going to, it won't turn them off because they've been a fan for whatever, 50 years or whatever, some of them out there, all your life. What you're going to present probably won't turn some fans away. Maybe if it does, it does, but at least it'd be adding something to the discussion.
Well, that's another fascinating point. Like, I don't know all of the ins and outs of the making of, this movie, the stories have been told or the stories that haven't been told. What we get in this documentary is it was a very rough shoot for reasons that are not hard to imagine, and that Marilyn Burns went through hell,
Mhm.
almost getting method to the point, or being put into a method position to the point where she may have actually been going crazy. I think it was Adam Marcus, the director of Friday the 13th, Jason Goes to Hell, was talking about the number of takes that they had to do for, I don't remember if it was the bucket scene or the dinner scene, but it was like an ungodly amount of time they had to spend of people like pretending to go crazy and maybe actually snapping at some point. But if you have that conversation and be like, would Tobe Hooper, if he were to make this movie today and all this information came out about it, would he be canceled? You know, not that he did anything, you know, quote unquote wrong, but if you had this onset safety regulations and sensitivities that we had today, would you have ended up with the same film, or would it have just been a generic kind of horror movie? Would you have gotten that realism? And is that realism and what it may have done to Marilyn Burns', you know, psyche, or the other people who were on set? What's the trade-off? Like, do you want to give them a life of, you know, mental issues in service of creating a classic horror film that's going to stand the test of time? Whole nother documentary you could make on that.
You could, and they, it's not like it's brought up in this documentary, but it's literally, I think you have one of the people saying, yeah, and the hammer scene is disturbing, and you know, seeing hit grandpa trying in that, and I'm not sure how many takes that took, but I'm sure it was probably a number of them, and it had to be, you know, but it was speculation. We didn't have anyone saying, oh yeah, it took like, you know, 32 takes or whatever, and by the end of it, you know, and then there's another person who mentions, yeah, I had heard the stories about the conditions on set and how it was 90 degrees, and you know, they do mention about how Gunnar Hansen smelled, you know, and so they give you some tidbits in there, but if you go into this expecting it to be all like that, you're gonna probably be disappointed.
Yeah, this would be a great, like, the legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for beginners, you know? And then you have another supplement where it's just like 5 fun facts about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you take the, you know, few minutes of the actually newish information that we get out of here and you splice that in together into like a little, you know, 5-minute clip reel or something. It's just going back to the idea of like, if I'm a diehard fan who's been in love with this film since it came out or since, you know, childhood, I'm really looking for new territory, I'm going to plunk down all this money for something. It better be something new and exciting and, you know, dare I say, adventurous, possibly controversial. Otherwise, like, well, yeah, then I just, the movie looks great in 4K and I'll plop down money for the 8K.
Well,
But supplements, who cares?
well, that's the thing, is this has already been released in 4K at least once already. I've got the 40th, and it's still in its plastic, but I got the 40th anniversary edition that touts being in 4K. And the reason I remember that is because when I got it, I went to my buddy, because he's got a 4K system. I'm like, hey, can I come over and watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre? And he's like, you know me for 30 years. What do you think my answer will be to that? And I'm like, okay, so that's a no then. He's not
Get
a
better
big
friends. No, what?
yeah, he's not a big horror fan, but you know, it's that's another thing, is it's we have this on 4K already. You know, and while this is supposed to be a new transfer with even more commentary on it, that's great. But as far as the other things, you know, people are scaling back a little bit in their dipping and not doing as much double dipping as, say, us Star Wars fans back in the day of, why, yes, I have 4 copies on VHS and 2 on deep. Why, you know, anyway.
Waiting in line at, you know, midnight at Best Buy to get those newer editions, and wow.
I have it on special edition, and I've got the last THX VHS release of the original, quote unquote, original cuts of the film before they were special editioned. So I've got, that's what I made my kids watch. So
You're a good dad.
yeah, well, you know,
That's
and now
responsible parenting.
and now on streaming we have McClunky. So you know, I just it's it's one of those things where quit messing with the seat. You're just making it worse. It's like picking at a scab. Leave the Han Solo Greedo seat alone. You keep picking at the scab, it's gonna scar it. It's scarred our whole arm now. But back to this thing. Again, it's well produced. I like the fact that it's all interviewee stuff. You don't have Mr. Voiceover stuff, but at the same time, I felt like the new stuff could have been put together into a shorter documentary that I may have not would have probably found more interesting than this, because after a while I was kind of checking out just because as they were talking about stuff I already knew, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I had that same experience, you know. The phone was, you know, in bed next to me, like just out of arm's reach, and then eventually I brought it within arm's reach, and I'm just kind of like listening and watching. You know, yeah, I know I'm not supposed to do that, but yeah, it's needs must. Anyway, Mark, any final thoughts on the legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
Again, a documentary to where if you are looking to pick up a copy of this, you don't have a copy of this, you're newer to Texas Chainsaw, you've only seen the film and looking for a collection to pick up, definitely pick this up, especially if you have a 4K system, because you have pretty much all the supplemental material that's ever been released about the film on the Blu-ray. There's plenty here to dive into, you know, with it. Just don't get it just for that documentary. If you're a heavy fan and you have other copies of this, if you all want them in one place, great. The steelbook is beautiful.
I love those posters.
And I can mail them to you if you want.
No.
But if you're looking for something that's going to be like a really new discussion or interesting discussion that you haven't seen before, if you've been a longtime fan, the documentary that they tout on here will be disappointing, but the rest of the supplemental material, I'd still pick it up, and it's still worth watching once. It's just not one of those documentaries where it was really jaw-dropping, eye-opener one that, you know, I'd watch again because wow, I missed that you know, I've got to see that info again. It's definitely familiar territory.
Yeah, well said. And I think about, and maybe it's unfair, but I gotta compare it to other, you know, series retrospectives like they did for Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, like the Crystal Lake Memories doc is, you know, those both have like 8 and 12-hour, you know, multi-part documentaries for them. And this is like, so maybe that's someday that we'll get that, and that'll be on the 60th anniversary, and it'll be like $500. And it'll come in a replica chainsaw that actually works. Now
there you go.
And I'll probably buy it.
Anyway,
all right, Mark, the Movie Man Krawcheck, thank you again for hanging out and talking movies. It is one of my favorite movies. I watched it when I was way too young, as I'm sure we both did. And it means a lot to us. So yeah, check it out. We come at this from a place of love and criticism, so take it for what it's worth. And Mark, you know, we're going to be talking, you know, I'm on the spoiler room.
You are
every week, and we've switched it up to Mondays instead of Tuesdays, live, starting at 9:30 p.m. Central. So and we're going to be talking tonight about The Host when this goes up. Now I realized you tried to clue me in, I think, on our last episode, and I breezed right by it, but we're not talking about The Host, was it the Bong Joon-ho movie?
Yeah, no, we've talked about that already on the spoiler room. No, this is the blue-eyed, soul-possessing alien one that came out during the time when the young adult craze was picking up in 2013, 10 years ago. You know, the get on the Hunger Games train, so to speak.
It was written or co-written by Stephanie Meyer, who gave us Twilight. So you know, look, the problem is, and I'm gonna watch it and talk about it with you, it's one of those films which I'm pretty sure I saw, but I can't remember anything about it, and that might be because it was so traumatizing, so boring, that I blocked it out of my memory. But who knows? Maybe a few years on, I'll have softened a bit.
I think I watched it as well. Again, that's why I'm wondering. And it's not part of our Perfect 10 series, even though it is from 2013, but I picked it because this month we're talking about films that have aliens controlling people. We did The Hidden last week. We'll be doing The Puppet Masters. And then, you know, next week will be our Perfect 10 episode where we talk about Upstream Color. So, which again, it's hard to talk about aliens taking over bodies without diving into the horror genre. So
it all lines up. No complaints here. Well, there might be some complaints when we start talking about the host.
But
anyway,
can't wait.
So yeah, everybody check out Mark's stuff at Special Mark Productions. Again, he does video reviews and interviews and stuff like a madman. And it's all great stuff. And he's a dear friend. So thank you, Mark, once again. And yeah, we'll talk soon.
Been a pleasure.
All right, man. Take care.
Thank you, sir.